Hello everyone, this is Mr. Storm, and today we are going to, we're going to start creating our first game project. Now, as you'll notice, I have already created a new project titled Pong. You go ahead and do the same. If you need to remember the steps, review the previous lesson about our Godot introduction that teaches you all of these panels and what these buttons do and everything else. So review the previous video and lesson if you need help with that. But now that we have our project, we have an empty scene here. I'm going to switch to 2D view so that we can see it in 2D. We're going to do the most basic thing that we can do in a game engine, which is create a new object and then get that object to move on our screen. So let's create a ball in this scene for a simple Pong game. Now, with this new scene, we need to pick a root node, basically the main node inside of our game. So the root node for this is going to be something that can move around in 2D space. The best node for this would be kinematic body 2D. So we're going to click on this plus button here, and we are going to search for kinematic body 2D. So kinematic body. Now notice that there are two options. We have kinematic body and kinematic body 2D. The 2D version is the one that we want because that's the kind of, we're building in 2D, not in 3D, right? So we're going to click create. Now inside of this node here, I actually want to change the name of it. So if we double click on that new node, we can change it, and I'm going to change it to ball. All right. Now that we have a parent node, we're going to ignore this error for now. We have a main node for our scene. We can actually save this scene. So let's go up to scene and then save scene. And it's going to ask me, what is the file name and where do I want to put it? I'm just going to click save. It'll be called ball.tscn. So let's click save. So now I can see that I've now created a ball scene. Okay, perfect. Now let's talk about these errors. This error is telling me that this node has no shape, so it can't collide or interact with other objects. Consider adding a collision shape 2D or collision polygon 2D as a child to define its shape. Okay, well, that's pretty easy to do. All we have to do is add one of those nodes as a child of our ball object. But before we do that, though, we want to create we want to use a node that will allow us to attach some artwork to this object, because as you can see, it's invisible. It's there, but we can't actually see what the ball looks like. So let's create some artwork first. So we're going to select the ball object. The ball node. We're going to click this plus again, and we are going to look for a node called a sprite. All right. Now a sprite is just a flat 2D piece of artwork that we can apply to objects to give them some, basically some form, some shape. All right. Now notice that sprite is indented and underneath this ball node. That means that sprite is a child of ball. So if ball were to change its properties in some way, it would also affect the sprite, meaning if I move the ball around in our scene, it'll move the sprite with it, which is good. We want the sprite to move with the object. Okay, so now if we look over here in the inspector panel, we'll notice that we have a bunch of options here. One of the first options we see is texture. Texture is essentially just a fancy word for picture. Like, what do we want the picture to be associated with this sprite to be? Luckily, down here in our file system menu, we have a picture that we can use. It's called icon.png. If we drag this icon and drop it into this texture slot, notice that now we have some artwork attached to our ball. Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and actually change the color of this because I don't want the robot head. I don't want this thing to be here. So I'm going to go over here to Canvas Item, Visibility, and change the modulate color to be solid black. And that'll make it a nice solid black ball. Okay, perfect. All right, so now we need to add a collider. Colliders are essentially, they allow this object to collide with or bounce off or interact in some way with other objects in our game. So what we can do is to add a collider, we just select the ball node, and then we click the plus, and we look for a collision shape 2D. Collision shape 2D, and click create. So now we have a collider, but it doesn't actually have a shape, and that's what this warning is telling me. It says you have a collision shape 2D, but you need to provide it with a shape in order for it to work properly. So to do that, all we have to do is come over here to our inspector again, look in shape, click this drop-down menu, and choose a shape that matches the object that this collider is attached to. So for us, it's a rectangle, so I'm going to choose new rectangle shape 2D. Now if I zoom in, I can more easily control the shape of my collider. I'm going to use these handles here to essentially just create or extend this collider, that's a better way to say it, so that it covers the ball sprite. Now what this means is anytime another object with a collider interacts with this green barrier, then it'll make our ball do something. Okay, perfect. All right, so that's a lot we just did. We created a new ball, we've added a sprite node to it and gave it a texture, and we added a collision shape 2D node to it and we've given it a shape. Let's go ahead and save that scene so that we don't lose our progress. Now it's time for us to get into some programming. Right now the ball doesn't do anything, it just sits there. But we want to give this ball some instructions. Programmers write their instructions in something called a script. Scripts are made up of individual lines of code, which all mean something to the game engine, right? And so these code segments will make things happen inside of your game whenever you write them properly into a script. So if it sounds like scripts are pretty important for video games, they really are. Most game development is programming. So let's go ahead and write our first script. To do this, we have to select our ball node, and we have to click this icon, this button that looks like a piece of paper with a green plus. All right. And then we get this new menu called Attach Node Script. Now, there are a lot of options we can change here, but we don't really want to change very many of them. One thing we do want to change, though, is this template. Let's go ahead and select empty so that we don't have any extra code clogging up our script. And let's click create. All right. So now we have our new script, and it only has one line of code inside. This extends kinematic body 2D. This line means that our script is borrowing some code from this kinematic body 2D object. We want this line in here because there are some things that we're going to write later that require this statement to be in there. So don't accidentally delete or modify this line in any way. Leave it alone. Okay? All right. So before we begin writing some new code, though, let's think about what we are going to need. Let's go back to our 2D view and let's talk about how Godot handles its grid system. So if we think back to, let's say, math class, and we talk about grids, you have an axis, which is an x-axis, a horizontal axis, and you have an axis, which is the y-axis, which is vertical, right? Y is vertical, x is horizontal. And if we look at the very center of our axes, our x and y, they intersect at 0, 0, right? Perfect. And if we look at the numbers over here on the side, we can see that if we were to go right on the x-axis, we would be going in a positive direction. So right about here is 300 on the x. So if I was moving, let's say, I don't know, 3 frames per second, in a positive direction on the x, then I would be moving this direction. And it's the same thing with the y. If we were moving in a positive direction, we would actually be moving down on the Y. Now, this blue box here indicates our game screen. So if we were to actually view our game right now, we would see that our ball is stuck up in the corner of our game screen and we only see a little part of it. So this means that if we want to move down on the, or if we want our object to move down, we need to give it a positive value on the Y. If we want it to move up, we need to give it a negative value on the Y. So those things are a little bit flipped. But once we get this grid system figured out and we understand how movement works, it's going to make a whole lot more sense later whenever you're trying to move objects around on your in your game. Okay, so let's go back to the ball script and talk about how to translate what we just learned into actual lines of code. Well, if you think about it, we're going to need to hold a value for our movement on the X, and we're going to need to hold a value for the movement on the Y. So this is going to require us to have two values that we can store. Now, in programming, to store a value, you use what's called a variable, right? And in GD script, which is the programming language we're using, you're going to use the variable, or you're going to use the keyword var to create a variable. Now, one of the variables we need to store is the value of movement on the X, and one of them is the Y. So we're going to call this first one X speed, and we'll set it to, I don't know, 200, and we'll create a new one called Y speed, and we'll set it to 100. Okay, so essentially this is just saying that we want to put a positive value of 200 on the X and a positive value of 100 on the Y. Now notice that these variables by themselves don't do anything. Our game, or sorry, our ball isn't actually going to move or do anything for us right now. In order to make that happen, we need to write some more code. First, let's create a variable that can store the values of both the X and the Y. So we're going to create something called velocity. All right. Now, velocity is going to be a special variable that stores what's called a vector2. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Now, at the very beginning of our game, we need to give these values, X speed and Y speed, to our velocity. So we're going to create something called a function. Now, functions are specific sections of code that are triggered at specific times. For example, this func ready, or this ready function that we've just created, this will fire off as soon as the game starts, or as soon as this object exists in the game. Now, inside this ready function, we want to set the value of velocity equal to a vector2 with an X value and a Y value. Notice that this helper is coming up, right? Now, a vector2 can store an X value and a Y value. Luckily, we already have those. We've created variables for them. So the X value is going to be X speed. The Y value is going to be Y speed. Okay, perfect. Now notice that this line is indented underneath the function. That's incredibly important. If you don't do that, this will not work properly. Okay? Alrighty. Now we just need to apply this velocity to the actual object itself. Well, to do that, we need another function. This function is going to be function physics process delta. Physics process delta is going to allow us to call this code, whatever's inside physics process delta, every single frame of the game. Super, super, super important, right? Whereas ready will only call it once, this will call it many times per second. All right, so if our game is running at, let's say, 60 frames per second, whatever's inside of here will be called 60 times per second. Now, inside of this physics process delta function, we are going to use a line of code, or let's say a command called translate. Translate is going to basically change the value of the position of an object. So it's basically just going to move an object. And we need to move it in two different directions. For us, we are moving it in velocity because we've already stored our two directions there in velocity. And we're going to multiply velocity by delta. Delta is a fancy programming word that essentially means the amount of time that has passed since the last frame, right? So this is going to smooth out our movement a little bit. Now, in order to test this out, to make sure that our movement actually works, we need to build a scene for the ball to live in. Right now, the ball is in its own scene, but in order for the ball to do something, it has to be inside of a parent scene so that it can move. Let's go ahead and save this scene and create a new one by clicking this plus button here. Inside this new scene, we need to give it a parent root node. So the root node is going to be 2D scene right here. Let's go ahead and rename node 2D to Pong, because this is where we're going to build the rest of our game. And we can actually go back to our 2D view here for now. Inside Pong, we want to bring in that ball that we just created. It's actually pretty easy to do so. All we have to do is click this icon that looks like a chain. This is going to link our two scenes together. We're going to choose ball.tscn, click open, and now we have a ball inside of our scene. Let's go ahead and drag the ball over into the scene a little bit more so we can actually see it. And if we were to hit play right now, we should see the ball moving in a downward diagonal or right to down diagonal. All right, let's go ahead and try that out. Now, by clicking play up here, I've indicated that I want to play the scene. But right here it says no main scene has ever been identified. Should we select one? And we can try to select current, but nothing's happening. The reason why is because this is not saved yet. Let's go ahead and save scene and call it pong.tscn, click save. Now we can hit the play button and click select current. And now every time we hit play, this scene will open automatically. So notice that my ball traveled across my scene and left the screen. That's exactly what we want it to do, right? It's moving in the direction I've told it to move. Now, the challenge is, let's see if you can make this ball, instead of moving this way, let's see if you can make it move that way, or up and down, or right and left. Let's see if you can change the speed of this ball, right? See how many different ways you can make this ball move around by modifying the script and testing it out in your game engine. Okay. At this point, once you have your ball moving in the game, you finish the first important step for creating a brand new video game. All right. Experiment with your X speed and Y speed values to see how you can get your ball moving, and I will see you in the next video.